Knowledge is power when you're an overseas investor thinking of buying an Australian property. Whether you're living overseas as an Australian citizen or an approved migrant, or you're a foreign investor thinking of buying in Australia, knowledge is the key to success. And there are 14 sort of pitfalls or strategies that I've identified over the years that many people living overseas, as I say, whether you're an Australian citizen or a foreign investor who have been thinking of buying, generally making. So there are 14 common and costly errors. You can find a link to my full report about the 14 errors in the description below. But one of the common pitfalls that people make is trying to buy their dream property from the very beginning. Let me explain what I mean by that. You see, it's very tempting to try and grab that dream property while you're living overseas, but it may not be realistic. Circumstances change, life changes, marriage comes along, divorce comes along, children come along, job transfers come along, plans change. And what you buy today in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, or 10 years' time may not be what you really think of as your dream property at that time. Let me explain. My own story probably explains that the best. This was the time a number of years ago where I had some investment apartments in Australia in different cities, in Sydney and Melbourne, but I didn't have a family house for the children and the wife for us to live in. So we decided that if we had to leave Hong Kong, we were living in Hong Kong at that time, if we had to leave or we wanted to leave Hong Kong and we wanted a place where our children could go, the investment apartments simply weren't going to cut it. They were too small and we didn't really want to live in an apartment. It's pretty common. It probably resonates, with many of you. We wanted a garden, we wanted a dog, and the children be able to ride their bicycles, the usual sort of thing. So we decided that we would buy a family house. Now, at that time, I'd already been in the real estate business for quite a long time, and I considered myself quite expert. But what I realized when I went looking for a house was I was pretty knowledgeable about investment apartments and units around and near the city centers in the prime investment areas. But I was far from an expert in a house in a middle distant suburb. I decided to tag along after a business trip to stay on for a couple of weeks in Melbourne, as it was. Even though I was originally from Sydney, I had some investment apartments in Sydney, but we'd made a lot of friends in Melbourne. I was doing a lot of business in Melbourne, so we decided to buy a family house in Melbourne. It was cheaper than Sydney. Probably, I thought, easier to buy within my budget at that time. For whatever reason, we decided if we're going to leave Hong Kong, we'll probably go to Melbourne. So let's get the family house in Melbourne. And at that time, I took some very wise advice from my wife, who said to me before I left, she was staying back in Hong Kong to look after the children. So she said to me before I left, don't forget, this doesn't have to be our absolute dream home. As long as it's somewhere near, in a good area, near good schools, that we can move into straight away if we have to. Worst case, she said, and this was the advice, she said, worst case is we can sell it. And actually, even though I was in the real estate business, I thought that was really tremendous real estate advice. So without making this video going on forever and giving you all the details, I finished my business trip. And remember, this is important to remember, I am in the real estate business. I love looking at properties. I love real estate. I love looking at properties. For many people, looking at properties, 5, 10 properties a day for day after day is almost worse than public speaking. But I enjoy it. So I was really looking forward to searching for a house. So I took some advice from some friends who lived in Melbourne or had returned from overseas back to Melbourne or migrated to Melbourne, and asked them for the top suburbs. So I went looking at those suburbs first. So I spent the first 4 days of my 7 days looking in those suburbs. So on the 4th day, that evening, I went back to the hotel and I rang my wife and said, this is not going to happen. She said, what do you mean? I said, in Melbourne, it's really hard. Many of the suburbs look similar. And it's really hard to know what's a good buy, what's a good street. I said, I'm going to have to extend the trip. This is not really working. And the houses are either too big, they're too small, they're too old, they're next to a block of apartments, they're on a busy road. I'm not getting any straight answers from the agent. Most of them are going to auction, and I can't get any sense out of the agent about what price they're going to sell for. Are they in our budget? Are they above our budget? Are they below our budget? So I need to get some more knowledge, and I need to spend some more time. Now, I was in the very fortunate position at that time of running my own business, so I could take an extra week. Many of you are not in that fortunate position where you can take another week to look for houses. And in those days, buyer's agents to help the buyer, like myself, didn't really exist. It was very new, and they weren't really able to. Anyway, I thought, why do I need a buyer's agent? I'm an expert in property. I really, in hindsight, today wish I'd had a buyer's agent to help me on the buy side. Because as I mentioned, I went to open houses with the agents and asked what sort of price range, and I got wishy-washy answers. First question they asked me, well, what's your budget, sir? So I told them, and they said, well, this house should be roughly in your budget. So what kind of answer is that? As I said, I don't want to make this video too long. So my story is a very sobering story for anybody looking to buy their dream house. As it turned out, I extended, and on the final week, on the final day, the day before I was due to fly out, an agent rang me and he said, have you considered this particular area, which I never looked at? The area was called, for those of you who know Melbourne, was called Ivanhoe. I'd never looked at Ivanhoe. Kew was out of my price range. Places like South Yarra were well out of my price range. I didn't want to go too far out. I wanted to be in a good suburb. As I'd learnt my lesson, I didn't have to have my dream house, that is for sure. Just a house I could live in and move in, and if I didn't like it after a few years, could sell it. As it turned out, it's another whole story how I negotiated that house on the way to the airport. Again, it was another house due to go to auction, and again I put a special strategy in place that I tell everybody to do, that I help buy properties now through my buyer's service. I put a special property in place that made the original owner very happy, and as it turned out, she stayed in that house for more than 15 years after I had purchased it, and actually we never ever, as it turned out, moved into the house, but we made huge capital gains on the house. So the lesson: you don't have to buy your dream house first. It can be your second or third or fourth house, but get a great house in a great area that hopefully will make you some serious money in the capital growth. In the meantime, you can rent it out to help cover the costs, and worst case, you can sell it.